The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy. So our speaker this evening is Professor T.R. Kidder. He is the Edward and Teddy Macias, yeah, I got it wrong anyway. Macias Professor of Anthropology and Chair of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. He graduated from Harvard with his PhD in anthropology in 1988, where he was trained mostly as an archaeologist of America and studied geoarchaeology and environmental archaeology there, and worked in the Mississippi region for years, built up great expertise in these areas of subfields of archaeology, and then starting about a little over a decade ago, started visiting China and Central Asia and getting involved in projects there. And he now has this decade of experience of collaborating with large and small teams of archaeologists and other researchers in China, and working on these same questions about human settlement and its interaction with the environment. So we have asked him to come and open our series on this urban-rural relationship in China with some sort of deeper context. So please join me in welcoming Professor.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you all for being here. If you can't hear me, just wave your hands. So I think you probably all know the statistics now, which is that more than 50% of the world's population lives in a city. And certainly in modern China, there is an initiative to ensure that roughly 50% of the Chinese population lives in an urban area soon. I don't know the exact nature of this. And so, of course, this question about the history of cities and the history of urbanism and the relationship between rural and urban becomes a kind of pressing theme for thinking about the contemporary world. And I was thinking about sort of what did I want to say about this, and the one thing that occurs to me when I was in graduate school, that was many years ago, and was thinking about the relationship of humans and the environment, it was a very one-dimensional kind of story. And the notion was simply that humans were in some fashion relatively passive, and we were the recipients of some form of change caused by the environment, usually by some forces well beyond our control, notably climate change. And so if you think about sort of that the relationship between humans and climate, it tended to be, there's a kind of vision of humans as being sort of domesticated chickens that were sort of looking up into the sky and not smart enough to close their mouths when it rained, and suddenly that this would cause all of these changes in society. But of course, we now have a much better framing, or I think at least a more realistic framing, which is the notion that the relationship between humans and the environment is recursive. That is, not only does the environment change us, but in fact, as I'll endeavor to show, we change the environment. And the case I want to make here is that the relationship between humans and the environment in ancient China is, I would argue that it is consequential. It bends the arc of Chinese history. And if we think about China as an exemplar of this sort of what I call the Anthropocene world, it gives us pause to think about these relationships of people, environment, and the way that people and environment are structured. And so I want to just introduce very quickly this idea of the Anthropocene. And I think many of you have certainly heard the term before. You probably encounter it now in a lot of popular discourse. It's a very sort of buzzwordy kind of thing. And the Anthropocene, and it probably gets cut off, I'm sorry, but it says here, human activities have become so pervasive and profound that they rival the great forces of nature and are pushing the earth into terra incognita. So let me give you a quick example of an Anthropocene reality, which is that human beings today, for example, we move more soil than do all the rivers and natural processes on the globe. So we are effectively a geological force. We fix more nitrogen today artificially than do all the plants in the world. So we're a biological force. We, of course, have transformed the atmosphere. We now have CO2 levels at over 400 parts per million. I think it's 409 parts per million today when I checked. And of course, this is a greater level of CO2 than we have seen in the atmosphere for at least the last 3 million years, probably at least the last 5 million years. So we're an atmospheric force. So we have become arguably part of these large-scale natural processes. And this has become, I mean, this is a graph showing all sorts of changes, almost all of them beginning in what's called the Great Acceleration, beginning really 1945 to the modern era. And these kinds of terrestrial atmospheric biological transformation have led people, particularly geologists, to become interested in thinking about naming this. And this is the idea of the Anthropocene, the human epoch. So we have gone through the Pleistocene to 10,700 years ago. We entered then the Holocene, and now in some fashion we're entering the human epoch. And of course, in good academic fashion, there has been a great deal and a vociferous debate about when and what does this really mean. And particularly the geologists have become interested in what's called the golden spike, which is when do we define the Anthropocene as a geological phenomenon, and what are the characteristics that we can use. The anthropological and especially the archaeological community picked up on this a long time ago. They became interested in this question of whens. And so we can see this is a sort of set of Anthropocene histories. You can see there's a whole lot of contenders for when you could define the Anthropocene. Maybe it's all the way back with the emergence of niche construction, which is a fancy way of saying domestication of plants and animals. Or maybe it's the alteration of the Earth's surface or the Industrial Revolution or something like this. And I'll come back to this in a moment. The point being is there are many ways we could define the Anthropocene as an event, as a thing, as something that a stratigrapher, a geologist could go to and look in the geological record and say, that's the day that this transformation happened. Interestingly enough, very few people pick up on the idea of urbanism as an element of this kind of niche construction, this transformation of the environment, this reorganization of society and politics. And the one thing I want to remind myself to say, because I think it's very important, is when we look at all of this kind of construction of the Anthropocene, this era was a kind of good exemplar of this because the Anthropocene ends up, particularly in these geological constructions, and I mean no offense to my geologist colleagues, this is a fascinating question, but it becomes a progressivist argument. Basically, the Anthropocene is in some fashion deus ex machina. It just happens. It happens out of some progress. It happens out of some thing that just magically occurs somewhere, either here or here or here or here. But there has never been an attempt, in my opinion, to really engage in this question of how does the Anthropocene evolve and what are the consequences of it. So we can in fact pick a day and time, a very precise time, where it's, you could see this, it says, welcome to the Anthropocene. Because we can fix, in fact, a point geologically when in 1 million years, in 10 million years, in 100 million years, if they have the technology, a scientist can go back and they can look at the geological record and they can say, oh, there is a definitive human signal. Because what will happen is they're going to find cesium-137, iodine-139, they're going to find plutonium, they're going to find all of these radionuclides that are a signal of this kind of Anthropocene existence. They'll also find plastics embedded in all sorts of things. In other words, there's a geological explanation. I'm not interested, though, in the geological explanation. Because the problem isn't where are we today, because we all know where we are. The question for me, at least, is how did we get here? What are the ways in which and the processes by which we got here? Because we either make an assumption that the Anthropocene is just a thing that happens out of some kind of magic progressivism, that is, it's an inevitability, or in fact we question whether there are historic reasons and causes for this that give us a way to understand both how we got there and also, in one sense, I'd argue, where we are and where we're going. So it becomes an interesting question. And there are a number of people who are making a reasonable, I think, critique, and sometimes they get lumped together in what Carol Crumley has called the eco-Marxist critique, but it's the idea that the Anthropocene isn't an accident, it isn't a random kind of geological phenomenon, but in fact is the outcome of particular social consequences, which is to say, in these constructions, the deployment of capital, for instance, in the 17th and 16th through 18th centuries as a way of forcing people into particular configurations of social existence and effectively making power, well, you can't see this, it says the Anthropocene is a function of power, production, and wealth. Basically, the ability for some people to control nature as a way of consuming it in order to produce more. And this idea that somehow there is a social context for thinking about the Anthropocene. And for me, this has an interesting resonance. That is, maybe we can think of the Anthropocene not as this kind of magical thing, but rather the outgrowth of a set of human-constructed realities that have a strong influence. So I've become interested in this, particularly in the context of what we would think of as ancient China. And for me, given my work, ancient China will go up to about the Han Dynasty, so 2,000 or so years ago, plus or minus. But in fact, I'd argue there's a fascinating story that goes later, but that's another lecture altogether. And so I've been working particularly in a site called Sanyangzhuang, but also up and down the Yellow River. And what I want to do is talk about a number of variables to try to construct a story over the last 5,000 years that explains, or at least contextualizes, the Anthropocene in ancient China. And while I'm thinking about it before I go forward, I want to point out we have two major contexts, or what I think of as protagonists, the Yellow River here and the Loess Plateau. And I'll come back and talk about this in a moment. So one of the variables that we want to think about is this idea of climate. You know, I said earlier this sort of notion that climate is a forcing factor. And of course, climate is something that we have to contend with. I also want to talk a bit about natural resources, excuse me, and the way they shape and are shaped by human society. I also, of course, want to talk about demography, so population. We can't leave politics out of this, and if I had more room, I'd put politics, religion, society, all of these kinds of cultural things, and technology. And I'm using these 5 variables as kind of baskets or bins into which I can lump or place a whole bunch of different ideas, and they're just vehicles for thinking through ideas rather than being absolutes. That is, you could come up with your own set of bins and they would be just as legitimate. These are just sort of my bins. And if I were a better sort of user of PowerPoint, I could have arrows that go all over the place, because of course none of these things are independent of one another. And so, you know, I was able to just grab this one, but basically all of these interconnect. There'd be arrows all over the place. And of course, there are arrows outward from China. There are arrows to other areas that you could probably envision. And one of the things that I want to point out for our story, or my version of the story, is these protagonists, the Yellow River and the Loess Plateau. So the Yellow River is the 6th or 7th largest river in the world. It's one of the truly great rivers of the world. But the Yellow River, from a geological standpoint, from a fluvial hydrologic standpoint, is actually a very funny river because it's very water poor but sediment rich. And let me give you an example of this. The way we can measure sediment is you take a cubic meter of water, yay by yay by yay, you sort of dredge it out of the river and you evaporate all the water and then you weigh the sediment that's left behind. And this is sort of the standard measure of like how you would compare this. So if you go to the Mississippi River in St. Louis, not far from where I live, and you take that cubic meter of water, you evaporate the water, weigh the sediment, you get about a kilo of sediment, 2.2 pounds roughly, plus or minus, depends on exactly the time of year. This is post human manipulation of the river, but in other words, not a whole lot of sediment. If you go to the Rhine River and do the same thing, you'll get actually less than a kilo. Go to the Amazon River and you're going to get, depends exactly, somewhere in the order of about 20 to 25 kilos. On a sort of normal day, when it's in flood, it'll be about double that. So, let's call it 40 to 50 kilos of sediment, which is not inconsequential when you're thinking about a cubic meter of water. In 1962, after they had built the Sanmenxia Dam, they measured sediment ratios in the Yellow River per cubic meter of water of 760 kilos per cubic meter of water. There is one station that actually recorded 1,000 kilos per cubic meter of water, which, if I am correct, means it's solid earth. The Yellow River in these contexts isn't a river anymore, it's simply a moving landslide. And the reason it is because of the Loess Plateau. The Loess Plateau in central China is this vast, deep accumulation of windborne silt that comes down as a consequence of climate patterns, has formed over millions of years, and is deep, 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 deep. Loess is all single grain, which means it's simply all the same size because it's transported by wind. So all the small and all the large particles are left behind. You have this sort of singular type of sediment, and it's remarkably rich, but it's also incredibly fragile. So loess, when you break loess and you sort of create a cut into loess, it erodes immensely quickly. So what happens is, as the Yellow River passes through the Loess Plateau, it entrains these vast quantities of sediment overall. So keep in mind the Funny River and the Loess Plateau, because they really are protagonists in my story. There is yet another protagonist, if you will. I'm probably anthropomorphizing the natural world here, and that is climate. So broadly speaking, and again, I'm generalizing, but this is a good characterization, we can see that there has been a pattern from 12,000 years ago, so the onset of the Holocene basically, to roughly today, where we are getting drier and drier. This is a broad pattern in North China particularly, and it is a natural pattern. And this is because North China is influenced by the monsoon system, and the monsoon system has been getting weaker largely, and this is again a simplification, because the amount of energy reaching the Earth's surface, insolation, has been diminishing as a result of our changing relationship with the sun. It's just an orbital parameter. It's entirely a natural process. So we've got this context of decreasing energy, increasing aridity, and this is driving basically a whole lot of climate patterns. So this is the kind of big framing for thinking about this. And I can bore you with all sorts of data to show this generalized pattern. Understanding, like any set of patterns, there's oscillations and there's ups and downs and things like that. In the midst of this, we see what some people refer to as the mid-Holocene optimum, which many people, scientists, and I love scientific language, prefer to think of as the mid-Holocene thermal maximum. This is a period when basically, particularly if we're thinking about North China broadly, it was much warmer and much wetter, and again for entirely natural purpose, natural reasons. This is just part of the natural cyclical variability. A consequence of this mid-Holocene climatic optimum is arguably that throughout the areas basically north of the Wei River Valley, the sort of North China area, the monsoon gets deeper into the continent, more rain is falling, it's generally wetter. So we would think of the environment as basically being richer, well, not richer, that's a wrong way of framing it, certainly warmer and wetter. And what we see is an increased output in biomass. We see basically a lot more water, a lot warmer temperatures, and maybe surprisingly, maybe coincidentally, certainly an expansion of humans, particularly deeper into the sort of interior, especially into this Loess Plateau. And so one of the things that we see is kind of an interesting preconditioning, which is that people go up into this area and then it starts to get drier and drier. By the time we get to roughly 5,000 years ago, and I'm skipping ahead, I'm eliding a whole lot of data about the early development of what we would think of as prehistoric China, we begin to see the emergence of these large precocious cities in China. And perhaps the earliest and one of the most fascinating is Yangzhou, down here near Shanghai. This is this massive site where basically what you get is this expression of political power and social organization that is really sort of remarkable. And I'll come back to talk about that in a moment. We see this at sites like Daosi and Shimao, which is just recently being exposed. Somewhere between 5,300 and 4,300, you're getting this sort of really big expansion of what certainly for the context are mega cities. Shimao is over 400 hectares enclosed in a walled community. And that's a large city for 4,300. Langzhou is affecting over 10,000 hectares, although the city itself is only a couple hundred hectares. These are really big urban conglomerations. Langzhou is a fascinating example here because you're seeing not only the creation of this sort of large city, but what we're seeing is humans are beginning to literally transform this environment. They're building a series of dams and water control features, and the entire city is a water feature, basically. It's how you're getting water in and out of Yangzhou. And the excavators, Liu Bin and my colleague Zhuang Yijie, argue that water becomes a controllable commodity and symbol of power. In other words, they're using this environment, arguably, as a tool for control or for figuring out how to bring people together and how to organize them in that landscape. At Daosi, for instance, we see, again, this is about a 280 hectare area enclosed by a large wall. It's a lot of bodies. There's over 50,000 people estimated to be living within the Daosi community. And we see, workshops and palaces and elite burials and commoner burials and all of these differentiations of people. Differentiations of people by power, by occupation, by function, and things like that. And interestingly enough, at Daosi, they build what has been argued to be one of the earliest celestial observatories, and an argument can be made that in fact the rulers of Daosi are in fact basically trying to commodify the cosmos as a way of controlling people. But they're also building walls, they're enclosing bodies, they are changing, I would argue, our relationship between people and society and the organization of them. So in other words, the point being is that these transformations aren't kind of just random, they are in fact directed, and they're directed by and for the consumption of resources by a limited individuals, particularly the elite. And the elite are maybe using things like the cosmos, religion, things like that, as a way of establishing a kind of control over the natural world. At Daosi, for instance, we begin to see the effects of humans on these environments. So at Daosi, by about 3,900, 4,000 years ago, we start to see evidence of large-scale flooding, and we can detect this in the geological record by the movement of these large gravels. And these are coming off the Tarshan Mountains, and what's happening is that we're getting flash flooding. And this flash flooding is mobilizing large sediments, and it's literally starting to bury the city at periodic times. And we can see from, for instance, the ethnobotanical record, the plant record, that they're using more trees, they're using more different types of trees, they're grazing cattle, they're grazing caprines, goats, and sheep, and they're creating arguably a context where as they expand their community, they're having an environmental consequence, which is leaving behind a distinct signature. And in fact, that distinct signature is ultimately, we think, at least one of the major causes for the abandonment of Taosa by about 3,800 years ago. Literally, they are destroying their own context for success. I think it's a little, I would add the caveat that I think saying it's caused by environmental stress is perhaps too strong, but certainly environmental stress is a part of the story of whatever happens to Taosa. We've been doing some work at the Dongzhou site recently, particularly a colleague of mine, Ren Shaolin, with there, we begin to be able to map the data in different ways. And so here we have pollen data. We took a core through some of the sediments at Dongzhou. Dongzhou is a site that dates from about 4,200 to, well, there's a Zhou dynasty occupation at 2,700, but most of the occupation runs to about somewhere around 2,500 years ago. 3,500 years ago. And we can use pollen as a way of measuring the effect on the external environment, because the pollen is recording the catchment, it's recording the vegetation throughout the region. And we can see an early phase of occupation, which is largely natural. And we can monitor this by looking at the organization of different kinds of taxa along the spectrum, the total spectrum of taxa there. We can see that somewhere between roughly at about 4,000 years ago. So again, this is about the time Taosa is being successful, Shimao, Liangzhu. We're seeing, for instance, increases in certain kinds of pollen taxa that are indicative, and it doesn't really show up there, but we're seeing more agricultural products. We're starting to see a decrease in the amount of trees that are in the environment. And then what we see in this major sort of late Bronze Age sort of phase is really strong effects on tree species, and the increase particularly in a variety of what we refer to as rudarial species. These are indicators of clearance. The landscape arguably is undergoing a major transformation as people are cutting down trees, opening up more land, planting more, presumably in this case, millets, and in fact altering the environment. And then we can see when the site more or less gets abandoned, you see a resurgence of various kinds of trees. The Chenopodacea come back. This is a reforestation. This is what we think of as a forest succession kind of environment. So what we're seeing there is this kind of sequence of people come in, they transform the environment. When they go away, the environment sort of starts to go back to quote-unquote normal. This is Dahachun near Zhengzhou. It's a small site, so sites like Dongzhou were cities. Dahachun is a small community here. We did another core, and this is the puppy for scale here. Yeah, it was real science there. So one of the things that we can do is, and I need to sort of introduce a population real quickly, we can measure or monitor population in a variety of ways. We don't have historical records. So one way we can do it, and again, there's all sorts of problems, and I don't want to oversell this, we can use simply radiocarbon dates. The more radiocarbon dates you have, the more likely it is you have more people, more sites, things like that. All sorts of problems with it. Ignore this. This is an artifact of how Chinese history is done. Once you enter into the so-called historic period, basically the Shang, you stop doing radiocarbon dates because you know the chronology. So one thing we can argue is that there's some kind of population increase, and we can see this in other ways to monitor the landscape, the number of archaeological sites, the size of archaeological sites. We're basically getting more sites, bigger sites, fewer megacities, but lots more cities. So there's something about the organization of space that is being transformed overall. And this next slide is one of my favorites because I think it really exemplifies the craziness of what seems to be happening in the Chinese environment beginning somewhere around 4,000 years ago. So first of all, this is a percentage diagram, so of course everything is going to be varying in proportion, right? Because it's all summed to 100. But the point being is if you look, these are trees, these are herbs, which is a broad, basically category that includes these ruderale species, and these are the pteridophytes. These are ferny-like things, spore-reproducing like things. Notice that for basically, 6,000 years, they're more or less stable, a lot of ups and downs, but nothing particularly spectacular. Get to beginning around 4,000, particularly 3,500, arguably as populations are going up, and then all hell breaks loose in the Dahachun sequence. So this is one site, one core, one data set, but you can begin to see these really wild oscillations, and it's not just the frequency of the oscillations, but of course what really stands out, at least to me, is the amplitude of these variations. That's the word. We're seeing something going on where, all of a sudden the herbs go up and the trees go down, and the trees go up and the herbs go down, and you're just seeing this seesaw pattern, and something is happening to the environment. We don't know what exactly. This isn't telling us, specifics, but one thing it's doing, and I think that this is a reasonable thing, is it's telling us that this environment is really different than this environment, and we ought to at least be thoughtful about the consequence of humans in that environment. So by the time we get to 3,700 years ago, plus or minus, we get into the sort of historical period with the Shang dynasty. The Shang become very fascinating in one sense because the Shang, they are historical in one sense. They're, of course, inscribing things on oracle bones. We can begin to read history, problematic though that may be. We also, of course, see different kinds of investment and arguably increasing concentration of power and wealth in a smaller number of people who are compelling subordinates to produce in order to consume at that elite level. So one of the things that we're seeing, and we not only see this in the archaeological record, with the material culture record of things being buried with elites but not with non-elites, but we actually have the Shang's own words. So we know, for instance, that they're going out as imperial efforts or forays to gather together stuff, to burn the environment in order to make it more conducive, to capture things in order for the king to have more stuff in his retinue and in his life, and especially arguably in his death, and I'll come back to that. So we have the historical record, and as Keatley points out, there is a notion as one reads this historical record and looks through the archaeological record that the Shang are particularly looking to reorder the physical world in a way that suits their particular needs. And when I say the Shang, I really mean the elite of the Shang, of what we would think of as the Shang dynasty. That is, the individuals who control at the top. They're gathering together prisoners, they're gathering together animals, they're gathering together material in order to exploit it as a way of creating an ordered world in part. And we can see this really dramatically at sites like Anyang, which is located in part of Henan province. Here's again a pollen core, and here I'll just highlight the pines here, trees basically. Look at this. So this is 3760. So basically with the onset of the Shang, all of a sudden, virtually almost overnight, half the trees or more than half the trees are getting cut down. And again, I'd note that this isn't just the trees like at Anyang. This is the trees we're capturing over a very large catchment, because these are pines, and pine pollen is particularly mobile, if those of you who have allergies would probably know. You also note that you're picking up the clearance species. The Salogenense here is particularly a good indicator of clearance. You're also seeing different kinds of changes in the sedimentary history. What we seem to be seeing with the onset of the Shang at Anyang, the late Shang capital, is a really dramatic kind of transformation of the landscape. And again, this is associated with a particular type of socio-political organization. We can see Anyang here. Anyang is a city by all accounts. Wanbei is the middle Shang capital there at Anyang, and Yinshu at the late Shang capital, located over here. If we go a little farther to the east, into the Yellow River floodplain, this is the region I've been working on at sites like Sanyangzhuang and Anshang, we begin to be able to record not just what's happening in the city, but what's happening in the rural areas. So we're now able to complement what's happening over this landscape. And the way we do this is we're reading, I refer to this as reading the Yellow River. So we dug a 12-meter hole. It's a 43-foot deep hole. And I am standing barefoot in the Pleistocene. I literally had to take my shoes off and dance in the Pleistocene. Sunlight had not touched this ground for 12,000 years. Totally cool stuff, if you're me. But what I have is an entire stratigraphy. I can read the environmental history of the North China Plain as recorded by the Yellow River, and I can use that then, just like a text, to be able to understand the long-term changes. And one of the things you begin to see when you look at this is that we have a punctuated history. The Yellow River is stable for a great deal of time, from roughly 12,000 years ago till 4,000 years ago. So just like the Daharchun core, where it suddenly goes wacko at about 4,000 years ago, my sedimentary history mirrors that kind of thing. So for instance, whoa, back up. There we go. I'm at 8 meters below the modern ground surface now, and what we're looking at is a Shang Dynasty ridged field. This, I would argue, is the last natural landscape in North China for the next almost 2,000 years. How do I know it's a natural, or at least started out? See all of this stuff here. This is bioturbation. This is being disturbed by organisms. As we go up the sequence, every time we get into a buried field, and I'll show you an example of it at a different sort of view of one from the Han Dynasty, we're missing all of this stuff. Basically, this accumulated over a long time period. People came and turned it into a field. And we find this over well over a square kilometer of area. In fact, that's just because it's 8 meters deep. It's really hard to get at this stuff. But we can see the nature of the organization of the economy, and we can begin to see the nature of the organization of the exploitation of the economy. Anyang is not just an isolated city. It's of course being sustained by a rural catchment, of which Sanyangzhuang is an example. And the interesting thing is that Sanyangzhuang at the point of the Shang Dynasty is covered then by a massive Yellow River flood, because the Yellow River is now becoming increasingly destabilized. There is the long-term history of the Yellow River, the periodicity of change is increasing dramatically. And by the time we get to the Zhou, for instance, we start to see, again, we have lots now of historical data to suggest that the Zhou were paragons of this idea of exploiting the environment as a way of creating identity. In fact, we know from their own writings that they are setting themselves apart from basically people of the field, from people of the woods. So they're literally using the environment and the transformation of the environment as a way of identifying themselves and setting themselves off from people. Again, this idea of change the environment, create something that looks particular to you. And we can again monitor this at a site like Anshan. So this is I don't know if you can really make this out. This is a irrigation ditch. You have 1, 2, at least 3, probably 4 sort of iterations of this irrigation ditch. This one is about 3.5 meters wide. It's about 1.5 meters deep. We've been able to trace this well over 5 kilometers. It's an extensive investment of energy and a transformation of that landscape. So this is arguably about moving water to where there's no water, right? What do you use an irrigation ditch for? To irrigate, right? You're moving water in order to be able to use it. So this is somewhere after 4000, probably about 3000 years ago. So at the end of Shang, beginning of the Zhou dynasty, very soon by 2900. So again, Zhou dynasty times, we see a major transformation. The Yellow River shifts its course because it's now less stable, and people have to move to build a levee. And in fact, they're building a levee here, and I've traced it out for you. You can kind of see it there. Right over here are some irrigation ditches. They're literally now covering those irrigation ditches. So we've moved from controlling water because you don't have enough to controlling water because you need more. They build a series of these irrigation ditches, and this is an investment in what we might call land-esque capital. This notion that land-esque capital is capital improvements on the landscape, which once you make these, continue to have a legacy of environmental consequence. So when you dig a ditch, when you build a levee, you are putting a lot of labor and effort into it, and it constantly requires maintenance in order for that levee to be able to function. And so you're creating a new ordering of society by using bodies, by organizing people in new ways that really require a lot of deployment of labor, technology, and capital. So we can skip ahead and talk a little bit about population. So by the time we enter the Han, in the year 2, we have the first census. I understand the census is imperfect, please excuse it, but at least we can talk about big numbers, right? We can talk about the fact that China, whatever exactly China looked like at that time, because it was a lot smaller than China today, it had a whole lot of people in it. This is equally as large as what we know of as the Roman Empire. And of course, you have these remarkable population densities of these large sort of, like we would think of these as sort of provincial type units. I looked it up real quickly. Tompkins County, where you guys are, has a population density of 78 people. So it gives, and the United States, by the way, has a population density of less than 30 people per square kilometer. And I point that out only to give a context for thinking about the nature of environmental transformation and its consequences, and we'll come back. So jumping ahead to the Han, and I know I'm sort of jumping ahead, but I want to finish this story off in time. We know that the Han become transformative in a number of different ways, but one of them, of course, becomes their imperial aspirations. They go out and they form much of what we think of as China today in all sorts of dimensions, not the least of which is territorially, and they tend to expand outward in a whole variety of ways, especially into the northwest, where they run into groups like the Xiongnu, and there's all sorts of, there's a whole political history we can speak about there in that context. But one of the things that becomes clear from Han history and sort of both reading the archaeology and the text is that these transformations of the Han outward are going to have rebounding effects back inward. And there's a great debate amongst the Han, even at this time, an example being the discourses on salt and iron, of what are they doing? Why are they doing this? What's the rationale and logic for expanding their empire outward? And they speak of the fact that their entire rationale, it's not what we think of as the Silk Road in terms of a commodity exchange. Arguably, they're interested in scarlet lacquer and pennant feathers, leather goods, bone, ivory, cedars, lindera, bamboo rods, fish, salt, rugs, and furs, yarn, linen, and hemp and cloth. And these are, quote, and I'll read this, these are all necessary commodities to maintain our lives and to provide for our deaths. This is a statement by the elite in an argument basically saying, we don't need this stuff to feed the commoner. We're not bringing goods from the empire's edges because we need food. We need it because we want to provide for our lives and our deaths. So arguably, much of this environmental exploitation, and we'll come to that in a moment, is a consequence of a political movement which is about exploitation of resources, not for the commoners, but again for the elites overall. And we can see this in a variety of different ways in many of these arguments about the Northwest expansion, or the expansion into the Northwest area. One of the things the Han do is they literally start to export bodies out of the very deeply populated eastern regions, which we just saw, which had high densities. They literally are sending them up into the northwest quarter, forming these tuntian, these sort of garrison forts, where these people had to become self-sufficient and, in fact, return things to the empire. And of course, you know, this took me a while to figure out because I'm really slow. Of course, you know, what's the great symbol of China? The Great Wall of China, of course. It's arguably started, well, it's certainly expanded by the Han time, and it took me a long time to realize that if you have a great big wall, you need people to like stand at the wall and scare people off, right? So in fact, what the Han are doing is they're literally exporting people outward into these environments, and these are the kinds of environments that they have. Quickly, I want to point out, at the same time, we're expanding our use of technology, especially iron. So the Han are masters of iron metallurgy. They have a technological capacity that's well beyond anything the West would see for well over 1,000 years. They're using particularly iron for various kinds of agricultural technologies, military technologies, and we start to see an interesting pattern of increased intensification that leads to things like new technologies back at home, where you're doing things like you're now recycling human manure into pigs in order to feed your fields, in order to feed your bodies. So we're starting to see a point where populations are growing, where they're literally developing technologies that will allow them to expand production at a time when they have lots of bodies and arguably limited land and increasing calls by the state for production. This is what ends up happening up in the Loess Plateau. Remember my protagonist, the Yellow River, the Loess Plateau, and climate. Well, here we are in the Loess Plateau. It is very erodible, and it's getting drier and drier and drier. And when it gets drier and drier and drier, we have less vegetation to hold the ground together. When it does rain, it starts to move sediment very quickly. And downstream, what do? You build great big levees, because this is the way you respond to this movement of sediment, right? So we know upstream that we're getting this stuff. This stuff doesn't just go away, it moves downstream. It has to move downstream, and you build up these levees. This is a Ming-Qing levee, but I use it because it's a good exemplar of this. We know that they have levees in Han times. And of course, there's a peculiarity here. So in the Yellow River Valley, the sort of like the Henan, Shandong floodplains and things like that, you've got lots and lots of people. You have lots of resources. You have to defend these resources. You build walls, just like you build a wall to keep the Xiongnu out, you build a wall to keep the Yellow River out. If you build a wall to keep a river in place, particularly a river that's transporting lots and lots of sediment, what happens is you constrain the river, and that sediment has nowhere to go, so it falls out. So what happens? The bottom of the river starts to build up, and then it builds up and builds up. So what do? You build the levees even higher. So what happens? The sediment starts to build up, and you literally see this pattern where they're chasing the river bottom. By the year 0, plus or minus, a site like Sanyangzhuang or Anshan, which I've shown you, are now somewhere between 2 and 3 meters below the bottom of the Yellow River. And you know, I was walking up the gorge today watching the water flow down, and it reminded me, in fact, if you don't remember this now, gravity sucks. Gravity will always win when you have a height difference between a river here and the land down here. So it's not a matter of if there is going to be a catastrophic flood. As you build these levees up, it's just a matter of when and what are the consequences going to be. And arguably what we're doing is we're setting up this pattern where there is going to be a mega flood. And in fact, there was a mega flood, and I'll come back and talk about that in just a moment, but because what it did was preserve Sanyangzhuang. And Sanyangzhuang is a small rural community. We know that there are at least 16 of these compounds, and you can see them here, and I'll show you some details of these. Interestingly enough, we also have the farm fields. Remember I told you we saw them at 8 meters down. Well, this is only 5 meters down, and we have them in perfect preservation. This time, though, when there was a Yellow River flood, there was no time for nature to have trees grow or anything like that. People rush in and they create these farm fields. It's so that the pressure on the land has become much greater. And at Sanyangzhuang, we have this extraordinary preservation. The roof tiles fall in place. We have, this is the edge of a courtyard. We have iron cauldrons. We have all of these objects. We can see them in place. So this is the kitchen, and there's a central set of tiles with the roof tiles coming out of it. You can see in this case the grinding stones situated here. Doesn't really show up there. They're the water jars. I can show you a picture in Sanyangzhuang with a kitchen that looks effectively just like this kitchen, albeit slightly dressed up because they're using plastic bowls instead of the ceramic ones. One thing that's great about Sanyangzhuang is it shows us the nature of the political economy and the engagement of people. So we know that they have, for instance, a domestic economy where they're producing their own whitewares. These are very cheap, crude things, and we have the tables where they actually threw their pottery, so we know they're producing them in place. We have a great deal of tile, and I show these partly because I want to remind myself that this is part of a broader economy of pyrotechnology. So we're not only burning for iron, burning trees for smelting iron, we're creating this entire tile industry here. So we're creating this large-scale environmental impact. We have lots and lots of technology at Sanyangzhuang. So again, I'm just sort of reiterating these points that we've seen before. Lots of iron here, lots of sickles and axes and bronze fittings for some kind of animal. We have stone trip hammers, and this is a Han tomb carving, showing them in use. So we understand something about the nature of this economy. We also have mulberry leaves. The preservation is so great I can lift the overlying mud off, and I have the casts of the leaves underneath them. And in fact, we have mulberry leaves, and these are being used presumably to feed the silkworms. We actually have the tubs in which they would soak the silkworms. We actually have the looms, or the bases of the looms, where they were spinning the silkworms. We have them, we know how they're organized relative to the house. Sanyangzhuang is one of the economic nodes of the Silk Route. It's one of the beginning places of this economy. But the important thing to point out, and I want to move quickly because I want to finish, but the important thing to point out is that the people at Sanyangzhuang are arguably engaged in this kind of economic system, not necessarily because they want to, but because silk becomes one of the major commodities that the government wants to extract from people. Because silk is one of those things that the government needs. And in fact, the way you get cash in the Han economy is by producing silk. So you're paying taxes either in cash or in silk. So it's a way of sort of creating a fungible economic tool, if you will. We know that they're engaged in a monetary environment, and we know that they're connected to a wider world. And I show these just again to remind me, but here are the ox hooves, and there's the ox cart. You can sort of see it. It's this remarkable story of this rural Chinese life, right, where they're plodding oxen are dragging along. We have the trails that are leading across China that connect Sanyangzhuang, this little teeny community, 600 or 700 kilometers from Chang'an, the imperial capital, but it's weaving this community together, tying it together, and it's about extraction, right? It's about the extraction of wealth, arguably, from this community in order to feed this imperial intensification machine. The government, it wants more and more and more. And it's not just things, I would point out. Arguably, the Han government is also producing bodies. Because, of course, how do you man the Great Wall? How do you fight armies? How do you conquer Korea or Southeast Asia? You have to have bodies. So we're creating an economy that is feeding both stuff and people into the system overall. And we can begin to see then by measuring things like sediment fluxes and stuff like that, we can begin to see that there is a pattern. The early pattern is a climate-mediated or climate-dominated system where you're getting drier and drier, which is leading to increased sedimentation because this is the natural outcome of aridification. But certainly by the time you reach 4,000-ish, note this inflection point, this rapid transformation. We saw this at Dahachun, we see this at Sanyangzhuang. We're seeing this major transformation, and these data points are coming from a wide array across the North China Plain. So we're now monitoring a much larger area overall. And we can begin to see then that the system ecologically or environmentally begins to fail. So in the year 1, in the year 11, and then again in the years 14 to 17, the Yellow River begins to reach a tipping point. We have literally raised the river up so high that it now has to flood. I told you it's not a matter of if it's going to flood, it's a matter of when. Well, when is the first couple of decades of the beginning of the Common Era. And what we see is a massive catastrophe across the North China Plain. And we see this at Sanyangzhuang. These are human footprints. This is a field. And this is arguably the last gasp of the people at Sanyangzhuang. They were trying, I think, in this case, because the flood happened in the late summer, early fall. I'll bore you with why if you want. Why we know that. They're gathering the last of the crop desperately in advance of the flood. Look how deep they're sinking into this muck and the mire. And here we're in an area where you are 60 to 80 kilometers from a 1 meter increase in elevation. I don't think these people made it. The fact is we know that there's a massive set of flooding across the North China Plain, and arguably this connects then with, by the year 17 to 23, there is massive peasant unrest. And eventually what happens is by the year 26, you get people, the peasants march on Chang'an, butcher the then emperor, and the country goes into a paroxysm of civil wars, and then you get the rise of the Eastern Han and their eventual withering away. And I put this up here, these are the wadang, these are the eave tiles that would have gone over the doors of the Sanyangzhuang houses, and this inscription would translate roughly to longevity. And of course I put this in here because the joke is there isn't much longevity here, right? This was a wish that was not fulfilled. And of course it's not fulfilled in part because this is, I would argue, a story of what I would call the long Anthropocene. It's an outgrowth of a historical pattern. What happened at Sanyangzhuang, what happened before and what happens later is part of a long-term history. And this is a set of data that we've just recently published on the consequences of land use change. And the reason I put it up there is because I just want to sort of beg the indulgence, particularly the historians here, because if we're going to describe the history of the Anthropocene, we can't think of it as an event. No more than we can think of Chinese history as beginning, let's say, at the end of the Ming Dynasty. If we're going to think about the history of long-term environmental changes, here or here, we have to look into a much deeper pattern. We have to look into the notion that these changes accumulated over a great deal of time. So here we are today at 400 parts per million. Haven't been here for over 3 million years. Your ancestors, my ancestors, no human ancestor, nobody who is called Homo sapien has ever experienced CO2 levels like this. We are truly in terra incognita. We don't know, this is the greatest scientific experiment ever run, and we have no idea what the controls are or what the outcome is going to be. How we get here, though, is part of this long story. We didn't get here because we started in 1960. We start this story at a much deeper time. And so if we're going to think about then the Anthropocene as a thing, we have to recognize, I'd argue, that it has deep and complicated roots. And the story of Chinese environmental history is the story of these roots. Because China today, whether it's a consequence of its environmental history or these complicated organizations of how people are configured in places and across the landscape, isn't something that just happened. It happens as a long-term consequence. And if we're going to think about the Anthropocene as a thing, if there's going to be a utility to it, and maybe there isn't any utility other than a geological one, but if there is, it's going to be because we understand that this is the consequence of this. It didn't happen randomly. It didn't happen accidentally. And I would argue it does happen as a consequence of the way human beings change and transfer the world themselves. So I want to say thank you to Robin, to Amala, very much for having me, and thank you for your time.